The attic smelled of dried rosemary and iron, a slow, honest scent that filled the rafters like a promise. Late afternoon light fell through a small streaked window and turned dust motes into a soft, hovering congregation. Glass jars caught the beam and held it like keepsakes, their labels browned at the edges and scored by a careful thumb. On a worn workbench, the alchemist, indefinido, moved with the kind of attention that reads like language in the hands, palm cupping a warm pestle, knuckles dusted with powdered bark, the faint rasp of paper as he folded a scrawled note into a tin. Here, where pots and tinctures sat in patient rows, the air felt like a library of smells. Citron peel, cedar, something mineral, and the sound of a low bell in the courtyard threaded itself through the room like punctuation. He had been slow to speak in the attic. He spoke mostly with repeating tasks, with the rhythm of small, deliberate actions that built recognition. Each morning began with the same careful measuring. A pinch here, the calibrated pressure of the pestle against stone, the soft sigh of liquid poured from one glass into another. When he worked, he hummed without words, a short, steady note he had kept for years until it felt like an address. The tactile vocabulary of his day lived in the weight of warmed cloth against a sleeping nest, in the smooth arc of his thumb along a jar rim, in the occasional chime of ceramic settling back into place. Sound and touch were how the attic's household spoke to itself. Scent stitched them into memory. There were habits you could read from the lines on his hands, faint stains of herbal dye at the grooves, a small scar by the base of his left thumb where a mortar had slipped once, the persistent softness of the pads where he steadied a fragile wing or an edge of fur. He kept a whistle, brass with a single hole, hung on a leather thong, the note calibrated to a pitch he had used for years. At dusk, he would lift it, breathe, and let the sound fall like an old password. The attic responded. A nest rustled, a warm body moved, and a low, rounded sound answered from a corner of woven blankets. These gestures were the work of tending. No single grand motion, but a score of small, repeated movements that, over time, taught presence and promised return. If this kind of quiet story moves you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder of steady care. By habit and by design, the alchemist's days were threaded with sensory anchors. Feeding was an exercise in patience, the clink of a spoon against a shallow dish, the damp, fragrant steam of softened grains, the texture of clean straw smoothed with a palm until it gleamed faintly under the slow light. He measured temperature not with numbers but with touch, pressed the inside of a wrist to a cooled poultice, felt for the faint warmth of a cloth against skin, and adjusted by the slightest shift, a fraction of degree rendered as reassurance. When he mended nests, he did so with fingers that knew the difference between brittle twigs and pliant bough. The fabric of the sleeping place smelled of lanolin and the earth, and the action made a small, private creak in the attic floorboards that had come to mean all is as it should be. Trust in that place was an accumulation, a dozen tiny courtesies, given without urgency and received without surprise. The companion to those rituals was the rescued creature, indefinido, an unnamed presence who had come to the attic under the care of a sanctuary. It was essential, early and plainly, to say that every close moment in the attic took place within a professional rehabilitation setting. Staff in the background, protocols observed, a clear boundary of stewardship that guided how the alchemist interacted. The creature's arrival had been gradual. First, the smell of unfamiliar breath, then the cautious testing of air with a forked tongue or a tentative hand, then a settling into the cadence of the attic's daily life. When the creature moved, it made a soft, resonant noise, half hum, half breath, that the alchemist learned to read like punctuation. Its fur or feathers, depending on the light and the way you looked, took his palm differently each time. Sometimes slick with damp, sometimes dry as stored grain. The texture taught him to alter his grip, to modify his pressure in a single, almost instinctive motion. Then the absence arrived, not with a single dramatic sound, but as a change in the quality of light and the tautness of routine. One week the whistle went unanswered. The room kept its breath and refused to release it. A note, marked indefinido for the reason, had been pinned to the workbench. Necessary measures, temporary transfer, professional assessment. The alchemist packed a small satchel with a sachet of crushed mint and a folded cloth, leaving a jar half full on the bench. The jar sat like an unfinished sentence, its lid screwed down with the precise pressure he always used, the scent of the contents betraying the recent presence of his hands. The attic, which had always offered the comfort of repetition, grew into a place of waiting. The mortar remained with a smear of paste. The bell on the larder door hung silent, and the cushions that had been smoothed every evening kept the indentation of an absent weight. That silence had its own textures, the floorboards unchecked by the slow tread that used to pass over them, the chill where body heat had pooled by the nest, the faint, almost imperceptible tilt in the balance of jars as if the room itself breathed differently. The rescued creature, indefinido, changed in small, visible ways. An extra scrape on a paw from exploring a new corner, a thinner tangle where grooming had been once more, a hesitancy at the threshold where a familiar hand no longer waited. Staff moved through the attic with practical sounds, the rustle of clipped notes, the soft zip of a case opening, murmured assessments in tones intended to steady rather than to alarm. Absence, here, was not merely the lack of one person. It was a gap in a system of care, a missing stitch in the pattern that had held them all. People who cared for the sanctuary found themselves listening for the smallest incidents as if they were proof of continued steadiness. Neighbors and visitors, who had once come quietly to see the rows of labeled jars and to spy the creature asleep in its nest, began to gather their stories in the kitchen downstairs. He always used this spoon, someone would say, running a finger along the handle and tasting, with that motion, the intimacy of repeated acts. The community's appetite for tenderness surfaced not as spectacle but as shared detail. How the alchemist folded spent herbal leaves into parcels, how he would hum when coaxing a reluctant eater, the precise angle at which he rested a palm to calm a tremble. These were small public proofs, carried like tokens from one person to another by the sound of conversation and the texture of remembered touch. When the news rippled that the alchemist would return, the attic itself seemed to wait in a lighter way. Dust motes made themselves more visible in slants of gold. The jars took on a clearer outline, and the bench bore the faint warmth left by hands that had once been there. The build of reunion was slow and particular. The creature approached the threshold with halting steps, pausing to map the space with scent and the tremble of its whiskers or the nervous click of its beak, testing for the familiar frequencies that had once steadied it. It paused at the mat where the alchemist had left a patch of wool. The fabric held the faint oil of his skin and the smell of last night's brew, an olfactory map that the creature could read. Each small movement registered. A lift of the head, the lowering of a shoulder, an ear turned in an angle that suggested listening for a particular breath. At the moment of reunion, it is necessary to be explicit about the presence of professional hands and oversight. The return was overseen by staff who kept to ethical protocols. A veterinarian or trained caregiver, indefinido, checked the creature's gait and breathing with practiced quiet. The sound of a stethoscope's soft click against the chest and the faint rustle of clinical notes being turned. Those professionals set the parameters for any contact. The alchemist's touch was not possession, but a response moderated by instruction. Even so, restraint did not mean coldness. The alchemist eased forward within the space permitted, his fingers curving like someone relearning the shape of a pocket, and the creature moved to meet him with a tentative hand that tested the new weight of trust. The embrace itself was small in scale and vast in meaning. Flesh and fur, warm and dense, met a human palm that carried the memory of hundreds of repeated courtesies. The creature pressed a tentative finger against the alchemist's chest, feeling for breath as if checking a map, and the alchemist answered not with words, but with a slow, measured inhale. The air in the attic tightened with the sound of a low, contented rumble that vibrated through the bench and the jars, like a note resonating against glass. The alchemist's shoulders loosened. You could see the way his jaw unclenched, the way an old tension leaked away through a small, honest sigh. It was not theatrical, no great, extravagant gesture, but it carried the density of time, the knowledge that many small acts had accumulated into the permission for this quiet touch. Even in that tenderness, professional care remained present in the room. A caregiver moved close with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to both healing and restraint, their hands checking the creature's limbs, wiping a stray smear of paste from a coat, the soft rustle of a towel against skin. Enough, a voice might suggest in the gentlest possible register, and the alchemist, who had built his life around the slow work of tending, stepped back with a practiced ceremonial modesty. He let the professionals complete the routine they had begun. That step back was itself a kind of love, recognition that affection must sit within the structures that keep both human and animal safe. Afterwards, the routine resumed with a new, subtle equilibrium. Staff recorded small gains, a steadier step, a brighter eye, a willingness to accept food from the maintained spot. The alchemist resumed his tasks with an added softness, smoothing the nest with fingers that still smelled faintly of the creature's damp fur, the sound of his work a domestic, reassuring percussion in the attic. Visitors who had watched the reunion spoke in low voices, trading details. The pitch of the whistle on the first call back, the way the creature's paw had curled briefly around a finger. Their reaction was not the clamor of spectacle, but the hush of people who had been given a small, fragile example of what steadiness can accomplish. Some eyes were wet, some hands rubbed at wrists as if to tame an emotion that felt too big to name. The story moved outward from the attic the way stories always have moved through small towns and quiet networks. By telling, by the passing on of a detail that is itself a kind of currency. A neighbor took the tale to a market stall, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the memory of the alchemist's poultices. A child recited the scene to a teacher using the exact, earnest cadence of someone for whom tenderness is a new revelation. In these retellings, the work of care did not become myth nor miracle. It remained concrete and tactile. People spoke about the way repeated small acts built trust, the precise angle of a cloth, the frequency of a song, the way certain temperatures soothed a restless body. These were the alchemical processes of human attention, slow heating, steady stirring, more craft than chemistry, more habit than enchantment. Later, when evening settled and the attic fell back into its private geometry of light and shadow, the alchemist sat with a small cup of something warm in his hands, its steam carrying a familiar, bitter trace. He listened to the faint sounds of the creature rearranging bedding, to the distant murmur of staff concluding their checks, to the soft closing of a door that signaled the day's work was done. There was a feeling in that room like the embers of a long-heated pot. Not a flame that flares, but a steady glow that will carry heat through the night. He straightened a jar that had been nudged, traced a finger over a label so often read it had begun to fade, and in those gestures the attic declared again what it had always been, a repository of remedies and memories, of small, tending acts that together suggested a kind of ancient peace. When the alchemist lowered the lamp for the night, the light pooled around the mortar and the pestle and made the room look briefly like a preserved thing, a study in texture, the grain of the wood, the dull shine of metal, the soft plumpness of the creature's nest. Outside, people who had witnessed or heard of the reunion carried the story home like a warmed stone in a pocket. They placed the detail near a dinner table or set it beside a bedside lamp, and in the sharing the act of care gained an audience without losing its intimacy. The attic's small ceremonies had become communal memory, not because they were spectacular, but because they were recognizable. Resemblance of action that others could practice, a measured touch, a repeated call, a willingness to step back when care required it. In the end, the lesson of the attic was both simple and stubborn. Potions and herbs were not talismans. They were tools with smell and texture, with the capacity to comfort and to orient. The real work of alchemy there was human, the slow composting of attention into habit, the patient exchange of confidence through daily, unremarkable courtesies. The phrase ancient peace belonged not to any mystical proclamation, but to the experience that steadiness produces, a calm that arrives after a long series of faithful actions, like warmth after hours beside a slow-burning ember. The alchemist, indefinido, built that peace the way he built his shelves, jar by jar, day by day, labeled and arranged, tended until the room itself could speak of the care it contained. If you have found something tender in this attic, consider returning to this channel for more quiet stories that look closely at the small acts which shape our days. For now, the light in the alchemist's attic lingers on the rim of a jar, the mortar still warm with the memory of work, and the deep, ordinary hush of an evening that knows its own slow remedies.